How's it going, everybody? So I was supposed to upload a video today about the Spain video game sales, but I'll be honest, I'm still kind of working my way through some data and links, and I've had a really long day, and just quite frankly, I do not feel like looking at numbers right now. So that video will probably end up coming out tomorrow. In the meantime, there are still a couple of lingering topics that I've been needing to address over the past few weeks, and one of them is specifically about the PlayStation 5 in Western markets, more or less outselling the Switch pretty much everywhere, at least in the holidays, and in many locations it started well before the holidays. Now, just to be clear, and I'm saying this 30 seconds into the video, even though I know that the people that I'm saying this to are probably not even watching the video, this isn't me trying to boast for the PS5's success. Rather, it's an analysis to understand why the PS5 would be doing better than the Switch 2. And more specifically, why is a PlayStation 5 that has slowed down in sales, especially in the States, still seemingly able to appeal to a casual market more than the brand new Switch 2. Because the reality is the people that are buying the PlayStation 5 right now, they're not your hardcore Sony fanboys. The console has been out since 2020, and it's been readily available on shelves for 2 or 3 years now. The loyal Sony fandom that wants a PlayStation 5 already has a PlayStation 5. This is in contrast to the Nintendo Switch 2, where maybe around 10 million people worldwide have now purchased their console, with roughly 1/3 of that entire population being in Japan. And my assumption, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the hardcore, loyal Nintendo fanbase is much larger than the amount of Switch 2s that have already been sold. So you have one console which is trying to recruit new people from the casual market in the PlayStation 5. And in this case, I'm using the term casual to define people that don't feel like they have to buy a console in its first few years of its life. And it's competing against another console which is trying to gather more of its hardcore fan base. That is the Nintendo Switch 2. On a worldwide scale, they're priced fairly similarly depending on where you're buying it. So with all the different bundles and models that are available both for the PlayStation 5 as well as for the Nintendo Switch 2, the average purchase price should be fairly comparable. But despite this, in pretty much all of the Western markets, it was the Sony console that was coming out on top and leading the headlines. And it just seems bizarre to me, and many others. Now, it's not exactly uncommon for a console in its 5th or 6th year of its life to outperform a new console in its first year, but generally speaking, that old console is outperforming the new console because of 3 primary reasons. First and foremost, it's because that console performs very well, as in it has one of its best sales years. So for example, for the PlayStation 4, it peaked around 2016 and it had a very strong follow-up in 2017, selling 20 and 19 million units respectively. 19 million units is huge, especially back in 2017. Those are pre-pandemic numbers. So obviously, with a brand new Nintendo Switch, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be able to keep up with that number. That's an unreasonable expectation. In contrast, the PlayStation 5, estimates right now are saying that there were maybe 13 to 15 million consoles sold in this past year, with its peaks coming between 2022 and more so in 2023 when the console was readily available. So it's not like the PlayStation 5 is having a very good year and that's why it's outdoing the Nintendo Switch 2. It doesn't really make sense. So that brings up a follow-up question. Why isn't the PlayStation 5 doing well? See, the assumption here for many people is to just kind of shrug things off as an issue with the economy or the greater gaming world. Basically, the idea is that everything with console sales is doing so bad right now, so the Nintendo Switch 2's embarrassingly low holiday numbers are completely justified. The fact that they were even able to move the units that they did during this extremely terrible time where nobody's spending anything apparently, that alone is worth at least 2 or 3 bing bing wahoos. But I think shrugging it off as being explicitly a macroeconomic issue is a bit of an over-exaggeration and quite frankly, has a hint of copium to it. Because the reality is, when you look at the slowdown in sales for the PlayStation 5, there are many very clear reasons as to why those would occur that I believe would have still happened even in an excellent economy. So starting off with the PlayStation 5, and I'm going to try to focus a bit more on the US sales here just to keep it consistent on a single dollar value, the US dollar. Many people have been comparing the 2017 PlayStation 4 success over the Switch 2 in the holidays, specifically in November, to the 2025 performance where the PS5 outdid the Switch 1. And I've kind of addressed this before, but the issue is that when the Switch 1 came out, the PlayStation 4 was discounted. The console launched at $399 in November of 2013. In November of 2017, it was priced at $200. So basically, people that were showing up in 2017, not only did they have a chance to buy the new PlayStation console at cheaper than what the Nintendo console was going for, specifically 33% cheaper, but it was also 50% off than what it was at launch. There was a huge amount of incentive there for casuals. Again, I'm using the definition of casuals as people that don't feel obligated to buy a console in its first couple of years, $100, but there was a huge incentive for those people to decide to purchase the PlayStation 4 over the Nintendo console. And that whole incentive was money related. Even negating the Nintendo console, just having a 50% off PlayStation console available during a Black Friday, that's going to drive up sales massively. So once again, naturally, you would expect such an exquisite deal 4 or 5 years into a console's life to increase the amount of sales that it can get out the door, because price drops help move consoles. Discounts help move consoles. This has been Sony's model all along. So you can't fault the Nintendo Switch for not outselling the PlayStation 4 in November of 2017. In fact, I think anybody that was doing so back then was being a bit ridiculous. In contrast, in November of 2025, the cheapest PS5 was only 12% lower than what the Switch 2 was being sold at. Remember, the PS4 back in 2017 was 33% lower. In 2025, the discounted digital edition PlayStation 5 was only $400, which would be $50 cheaper than the cheapest Switch 2. And actually, since these deals carried on through most of December, and I think Walmart still has the PlayStation 5 digital edition for $400 right now, I think this is extended on through the December months as well. But my point stands that even if you go for the cheapest model only for the PlayStation 5, it's only 12.5% cheaper than the cheapest model available for the Switch 2. And likewise, that same $400 PlayStation 5, that digital edition budget entry point into the PlayStation atmosphere, and I'm using the term budget sarcastically, that's actually the exact same price that the PlayStation 5 launched at back in 2020. Actually, I'll do you one better. That's more expensive than some of the lowest prices that we've seen for the PlayStation 5 digital edition. So again, in 2017, the PlayStation 4 was being sold not only at 50% off of its launch price, but it was the lowest price the console had ever been. So obviously, lower price, higher demand, more sales. PS5 in 2025, same price, basically, since its launch. So higher price means less demand, means fewer sales. And that's exactly what happened with the PlayStation 5 this year. So I actually think it's very unreasonable to assume a console that does not drop off in price this long after it's launched to sell as strong as it did previously, or as strong as the consoles prior to it did this far along in their life. Like, you have what, around 85 to 90 million people that have currently bought a PlayStation 5 already? At some point, the sales are going to slow down without prices being cheaper. This has always been the case. And while there were discounts in some locations which were cheaper than what they might have been previously, because of how much slower it's gotten us to the point with those discounts and how much less steep those discounts are now in comparison to the previous generation, I think it's entirely acceptable and reasonable and expected to see those console sales slow down even in an excellent economy. Right? Like, consider something like the Nintendo Switch. You had the Switch Lite come out just before the pandemic, and the Switch OLED coming out in 2021, which we're still pretty much in the pandemic. So obviously, that's when Nintendo saw its greatest success. It moved more units, people were buying their second or third Switch at this point, and everybody was trying to go out and buy a video game because they were stuck at home. After the console peaked, there was obviously a huge drop-off. Around 29 or 30 million consoles sold in the fiscal year of 2021, down a whole 20% in the following year, and an additional 20% in the year following that. But we obviously do not blame the economy for the loss in those Nintendo Switch sales. It's expected from a console that peaked to drop down in sales numbers, and even in some cases have a fairly steep drop-off, because with every passing year there's less incentive to buy in. And part of the way of creating incentive is to drop the price. So if Nintendo wanted to avoid those steep drop-offs in sales between the various years following the pandemic and the release of the OLED and the Switch Lite, they should have considered a price drop, and that actually would have made the Nintendo Switch 1 right now probably much closer to being the best-selling console worldwide. I'd argue it probably would have moved significantly past that. The same thing happened with the Nintendo 3DS. After the launch of the Nintendo Switch, they had an $80 Mario Kart 2DS released, as well as some deals on the more expensive models, and it gave the Nintendo 3DS a very strong send-off. But the point that I'm trying to make is that seeing a slowdown in sales with a console that is not dropping its price further along into its life when most of its fanbase has already adopted it is completely normal. It wasn't the economy that caused the Switch to slow down in sales, and likewise, I wouldn't suggest that it's entirely the economy to cause the PlayStation 5 to have a slowdown in sales. I would be willing to accept that maybe the slowdown was as steep as it was because of the economy, but not entirely. So like, for example, in the US, it was a 40% drop off from the previous Black Friday to this one. Even if the economy was better, you'd still be looking at like a 30% drop off. maybe at best a 20% drop off. But the point is that there are more factors at play here than just the economy. And the reality is that if the economy was the issue as to why the PlayStation 5 sales had slowed down, this doesn't change all of the pricing factors as to why it would outsell the Switch 2. Again, in comparison to the PlayStation 4 back in 2017, that console was 50% off of its launch price and 33% lower than the Switch 1 price. PS5 at best was the 12.5% drop from the price of the Switch, and it was flat with how much it cost at launch. So even if the economy affected the entirety of the gaming industry, the PlayStation 5 would have absolutely no reason to outsell the Nintendo Switch 2. It's not like there are any stock issues, because that's another thing that happened too, is that the PlayStation 5 was outsold by the Switch. So the Switch sold more than the PlayStation 5 through the first couple years of the PlayStation 5's life, but through that entire time, there were chip shortages, supply chain issues. The PS5 was selling every single unit that was made available, but as soon as you hit a single year where the PlayStation 5 had stock available and was easy enough to be picked up in stores, the PS5 outsold the Switch in that year. And you can argue that if the PS5 had those stock issues available earlier on, say by 2021, at that point you could argue that the Nintendo Switch would have still outsold the PlayStation 5 because it was in its peak years. But again, that would have happened because it's in its peak year, whereas right now the PS5 is outselling the Switch 2 without being in its peak year. So the PlayStation 5 is not in its peak, and the Nintendo Switch 2 has no stock issues. Those are the two reasons as to why the Switch 1 outsold the PlayStation 5 early on in the PS5's life. Neither of those things are viable here. And another major reason as to why this makes very little sense to me is that the reality is there are a finite number of people that are going to be buying consoles. Let's assume for a second that the most consoles that can be sold for both the PlayStation 5 and the Nintendo Switch 2 is 100 million. Right, let's just pretend for a second that that's the cap that this console generation can reach in sales. Logically speaking, that means that the PlayStation 5, or rather Sony, has to find a way to convince the final 10 to 15 million stubborn people to go in and buy their console, right? Because these people would be considered the least likely to purchase it if they haven't already bought it. Like, you start off with the most enthusiastic people, and those are the ones that were paying scalpers almost $1,000 in the very beginning. Over the next, 2 or 3 years, it went down to 900, 800, 700, 600, and then finally it kind of got down to the point where scalpers were not making any more money off of it, so it was finally just sitting on shelves. In the States, that's when it reached like 10 million sold at that point, by the way. And then after all of that time, that's when you have to convince a few more people to get into it, whether it's through offering discounts, releasing a huge game for a series, some kind of limited edition stuff, some bundles, anything that would appeal to people that don't feel like they were obligated to buy in early enough. But basically, usually it starts off pretty slow because that's what's available to be picked up by people. And then it starts to peak when it's readily available. And during that time, since the console generation is in full swing, that's when it's at its highest. And then it starts to drop downwards, and you have to get the most stubborn of people to buy it. And oftentimes the only way to do that is through discounts. But the idea is if your cap is 100 million, for the sake of this theoretical example, the last 10, 20 million are going to be the hardest to convince. Because it's like, what else do I have to do from you aside from offering this thing off at 50% discount? In contrast, those early numbers are usually the most likely to jump in immediately. And they're the ones that take the least amount of convincing, right? So worldwide sales numbers of the PlayStation 5 were around like 33 million by the time the enthusiasts finally stopped buying it, trying their best to get it from scalpers. That was around the end of 2022. Whereas in the case of the Switch 2, I mean, you're looking at what? 7 or 8 million maximum that were sold by the time they were just sitting on shelves worldwide, even earlier than that in a whole lot of markets. But hypothetically speaking, those first 30 million sales, maybe even push the bar back a bit and say like those first 20 million sales, should be a lot easier to get than those final 15 to 20 million sales that the PlayStation 5 is working with. So again, this just is another reason as to why none of this really makes sense. Right, let's look at some facts over here. The Switch 2 is basically having the worst holiday that Nintendo has had in almost a decade. It's being outsold by a console that is pretty much having one of its worst years because it's a lack of a price drop and because most of its install base has already bought in. And that console is the same price that it was at launch, and that console is the same price pretty much as the Switch 2, but it's still outselling the Switch 2. And I mean, to add insult to injury, everybody's saying that the PlayStation 5 did not have a big game that moves consoles this year. Like if Grand Theft Auto 6 came out right before the holidays, fine. I'd be like, okay, yeah, that came out on the PS5. It's not on the Switch 2. It makes sense why the PS5 would outsell it. But no, I mean, like the lineup for the PS5 was like okay. Nothing groundbreaking to the point where it would make sense as to why it's outselling the Switch 2. The reality is, when you break everything down that I've spoken about in this video, the Switch 2 somehow having a worse holiday season than the Switch 1 did in 2017, and also being outsold by the PlayStation 5 is kind of a weird anomaly. It's clearly not only because of the economy, because there are 2 times and in some locations even 3 times the amount of people going out to buy PlayStation 5, so plenty of people are buying consoles. It's clearly not because the PlayStation 5 has launch hype, or the Switch 2 has any shortages, or the PlayStation 5 has big games to move it, or even because the PlayStation 5 is significantly cheaper now than in comparison to the PlayStation 4 in 2017, how it was half off when the Switch 1 launched. Ultimately, I don't think you can blame any external factors as to why the Nintendo Switch 2 had such a poor holiday season. Not to this extent. Because that seems to be the narrative that people are trying to push, that all these different external factors are the reason as to why the Switch 2 is failing, in particular the economy. But the economy in and of itself did not cause the PlayStation 5 sales to drop off. In fact, the PlayStation 5 is following similar trends as to other consoles that didn't have price drops this far along into their trajectory, like the Switch 1. And it's not like there are no people that want to buy consoles. There are clearly people out there willing to buy stuff. I mean, generally speaking, there are a whole lot of potential buyers that would have purchased an Xbox console. Like, you removed one thing entirely out of the equation, so you lost a whole lot of numbers that easily could have gone either to the PlayStation 5 or to the Switch 2. Like, there are customers. Not to mention there are millions of Nintendo Switch 1 owners that probably wanted to upgrade and they haven't yet. So the reality is that the Nintendo Switch 2, in and of itself, has a major flaw. Actually, I'd argue it has many major flaws. The most important of which being the price, right? Like the PS5, a big reason why its sales have slowed down as much as they have is the same reason why the Nintendo Switch slowed down so much in its later years. It's because they didn't do any price drops or discounts. The price is always the first and foremost reason that these things are affected. It just so happens that the Switch 2 came in at a price that was already unappealing for the general masses that bought in at the Switch 1 at $200 for the Switch Lite, up to $350 for the OLED. So already just on the price of the console, Nintendo has an issue there. Add on to that, the prices of the games, absurdly high for something that's not worthy of that price. The prices of the accessories, everything across the board. Jumping into Nintendo, generally speaking, everything around it was always overpriced, so that didn't really change much. It's gone up a little bit, but that didn't change that much. But the console itself used to be a lower entry point that kind of justified it for many of us. And it especially justified it for grandparents that were looking for a Christmas gift for the kids. And then, of course, beyond the price point is the games. I don't believe there was a true killer app system seller that could have pushed the holiday sales. Maybe Bonanza if they had launched it in November instead. But I think that just might have pushed back some of the earlier Switch sales. Actually, I think I'm going to do another video about killer apps. That's something that seems to be coming up quite a bit recently. Well, I think there's a plethora of other reasons that could have caused some people to not jump into the Switch 2, whether it's the game key cards, the breaking of consoles, all that stuff. But I still stand by the fact that the pricing is the biggest issue, whether it's the price of the console, the games, the accessories, even the fact that the Switch 1 went up in price, right? Like Nintendo saw a drop off in sales, not only in the Switch 2, but in the Switch 1. Now you'd expect the Switch 1 to have a drop off, but the fact that the Switch 1 is more expensive now than it was at launch, that's also going to slow things down dramatically. The thing is, Nintendo is trying to distance itself from the word budget. And the reality is, whether you want to admit it or not, the only reason Nintendo is as successful as it is because it was the budget console. It was a budget option. You can launch a PS6 next year. It could be more expensive than the Switch 2 is. And I think it would have no problem moving units, even in this economy. Because Sony knows that Sony fans will pay the high price to get into their console. They saw it happen. They've seen it happen all throughout the years. Maybe not like a massive jump like they did from the PS2 to the PS3, but they could easily get away with a $600 console, for example, because their fan base has shown that they will pay for it. I mean, look how much they were paying the scalpers for the PS5 in its first 2 years. The reality is, a huge reason as to why Nintendo has been so appealing over the years is that price point. And obviously, I've harped on this quite a bit for the past year, and I don't need to go into further detail about it. But it's the truth. And it's ultimately the reason why the Switch 2 sales have slowed down as much as they are, and even more so, why they've slowed down against the PS5. Because as far as Sony fans are concerned, the PlayStation 5 is being sold at the price of a PS5. In their minds, they've either already bought in, or like I said, they're trying to convince those last 15 or 20 million people to jump in, but they're jumping in at PS5 prices. The Switch 2, on the other hand, when the Nintendo fans are going to the stores, and the Nintendo casuals, the ones that would have bought this as gifts, and likewise the Nintendo hardcore faithful that have yet to buy in, because there are definitely millions of more people that are hardcore Nintendo fans out there that just feel like it's not worth the value proposition because they're used to a budget console. When they go to the stores, they see the price of the PS5, They see the $80 Zelda, $80 Mario Kart, $80 Mario Party, $70 for Wii games. They see all of these things on the shelf. $70 for a racing Kirby title, $100 for additional controllers. It's no wonder that so many of them probably got to the store and they're like, what the hell is this? And then they looked over to the side and saw the NEX Playground. They're like, what the hell is that? $200? That's like the new Wii? Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, give me. This is ultimately the main reason as to why the Nintendo Switch 2 has had a poor holiday season. It's not the economy. That's only a very small fraction of it. The argument has always been that video game consoles are recession-proof, and you can't blame slowing down sales of a PlayStation 5 as to why that's no longer the case. The PlayStation 5 is slowing down in sales in the same way that the Nintendo Switch did because they did not drop their price anymore. Obviously, in the case of the Nintendo Switch, they sold more units prior to not dropping the price. But I think the Switch ultimately is and going to remain more successful than the PlayStation 5 anyway. So those drop-offs will have at slightly different times, and sometimes they'll be a little bit more steeper. And quite frankly, Nintendo is able to get away with it more with the Switch 1, was able to get away with it more with the Switch 1, because it was still the budget console out there. The Switch 2 nor the PS5 are not. So I don't buy in this idea that suddenly game consoles are no longer recession-proof. Launch a Nintendo Switch 2 at a price that is more aligned with what their fanbase has been used to playing, and then we can talk. Like if the Switch 2 had launched at $350, for example, and we still saw this massive slowdown, then I think we can have a discussion about how recession-proof this stuff really is. But they launched a Switch 2 that lost the biggest gimmick that Nintendo has to offer, generally speaking, the biggest novelty, the biggest reason people buy in, the price. They experimented with overcharging with the console in the same way that the competitors do, and it failed. It has nothing to do with the economy. Or, like I said earlier, if the PlayStation 6 was to come out next year, and it was like at, I don't know, $600 or $650, and that was considered too expensive for the massive Sony faithful, the same way $450 has been considered too expensive for the massive Nintendo faithful, then we can start having a discussion about how the economy was not recession-proof. But the reality is we have not had a console tested out for us truly yet, because nothing has launched in this economy yet to appeal to customer expectancy. I don't think a Nintendo console launching at 1.5 times price the last one launched at is a good way to gauge the success of a console. We saw the Wii had a 40% jump from the Wii to the Wii U, as for the deluxe Wii U, which is the one that everybody wanted, obviously, and that was considered too steep. And likewise with a 40% jump from the launch of the DS to the 3DS prices. So actually, this huge 50% jump from the Switch to the Switch 2 and having poor sales is very much in line with what we've seen in recent years with the most recent Nintendo consoles. And even outside of Nintendo, like you saw how much it failed when they jumped up from the PS2 to the PS3. I think that was like 2.5 times the price. And obviously it struggled big time. Xbox 360 to Xbox One was what, 66%, I believe? 1.66 higher than the original one. Whereas we saw a clear success from the PlayStation 4 to the PlayStation 5, where it was only 1.25 times the price. And technically, if you were okay with digital, which most Sony fans are statistically, the PlayStation 5 was able to be purchased at the exact same price that the PlayStation 4 was launched at. So actually, seeing the Switch 2 struggle in the holiday season is completely in line with what you would expect based off of past consoles. The new console sees a slowdown in sales, obviously after its like initial month or two, and its first 10 million shipped, for example, because of a 50% increase in price, and that's completely in line with what we've seen in the past during other changes in console generations. And likewise, the PlayStation 5 has a slowdown in sales because it does not drop the price. Historically speaking, when they drop the price and they have discounts, they move more units. Both of these drop-offs and slowdowns should be entirely expected, and as a matter of fact, this is exactly what you would have seen happen in previous console generations with these exact same scenarios. So I just don't understand why anybody would point to the economy as the main driving force behind this. The reality is we've been here, we've seen this, we've done all of this. The economy is not the reason the Switch 2 struggled during the holiday season. The PlayStation 5 having a massive success is also not the reason why the Switch 2 struggled in the holiday season. The only thing that beat the Switch 2 during the holiday season was Nintendo. They got arrogant, they got cocky, and they priced out a vast majority of their loyal fandom that would have bought the console year one. And if we had bought in, the Nintendo Switch 2 would have outsold the PlayStation 5, and nobody would even be mentioning the economy when it comes to console sales. The economy is only being used as a talking point in Western markets because the PlayStation 5 did better than the Nintendo Switch 2 as we neared the end of 2025.